I'm Joe Abercrombie, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Dr. O, Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Joe Abercrombie.
It's episode 258 of the Author Stories Podcast. We're wrapping up another week. Thanks for tuning in. We've had some great interviews this week. Why don't you go back through the archives at hankgarner.com and pick some other authors that you enjoy and dig in. Today's episode is with Joe Abercrombie. We had a fantastic time talking. We recorded this on Halloween. It was Halloween afternoon for me. It was Halloween night for Joe. What a spectacular talk that we had. I think you're really going to love this. The first few minutes of the show, you'll notice we had some problems with Skype and our connection kept dropping. So after, I don't remember, it's maybe 8 or 9 minutes in, we switched to the telephone. So you'll notice an audible little change in the audio, and that's why. Hopefully it's not too distracting. I think we got most of the problems edited out. But if you hear a little shift in the audio, that's what it is. If you find some episodes that you like in the archives, would you do me a favor and share those with your friends, family, and loved ones? I would really appreciate that. I hope you enjoy all the great shows that we bring you, and the reason we're able to bring you such great content is because of our sponsors, and I would like to thank some of those sponsors. If you would like to sponsor the show and highlight your product or service to our audience, go to hankgarner.com, and there's a link in the menu there at the top that says advertise, and you can highlight your product or service to our audience. Nick Breaker's book Essence, Book 1 Septima, one of the best science fiction writers I know. Nick Breaker weaves some of the best science fiction adventure stories you'll ever read. Essence, Book 1 Septima is a must-read. Go pick it up today. There's a link to it in the show notes. Third Scribe is the place for authors and readers to meet. Go to thirdscribe.com. You can set up an account for free, and you can link up with some of your favorite authors and find out what's going on with them. Authors, you need to have a place where you can highlight your books to your audience. Thirdscribe.com is built especially around books, linking people that love books with people that write books. Go visit them today. Thirdscribe.com. Tell Rob and the folks that I sent you. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned. Episode 20 just dropped today. It is amazing, with stories by Jess West, Rhett Bruno, Eamon Ambrose, Bob Williams. Tales is my favorite monthly publication. Go pick it up today and get that old pulp goodness feeling. Tales from the Canyons of the Damned, episode number 20, out right now. Also, don't forget, we're highlighting Tales of Dystopia this week, and we've got a special interview show with some of the authors from it. But Chronicle World's Tales of Dystopia, 13 stories of animals and humans interacting at the end of the world. This project also benefits Pets for Vets, one of the most outstanding charities out there, linking up rescue animals with veterans that need some companionship. So go pick up a copy of Chronicle World's Tales of Dystopia. It's only 99 cents while it launches. At the end of the show, don't forget we have an audio book clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.
Hey everybody, it's Josh Hayes, and I'm here with Chuck Manley and Scott Moon. We are Keystroke Medium, and this is the Keystroke Medium Minute.
Hi, I'm Chuck. I'm here with Scott and Josh, and this is a Keystroke Medium Minute. We're going to talk about knowing your goals for your writing. And Scott, you want to take us off on this one?
I knew you were going to punt this to me right in the beginning when I was completely unprepared, not thinking and not focused. But, knowing your goals is very important. You should know, you'll get the standard advice, long-term goals, medium-term goals, short-term goals. My favorite and most useful thing I've discovered over the last couple of years is what they call next action lists. So, like, my goal is to write a 5-book sci-fi series, and I have all these different long-term, medium-term, short-term goals, but like my next action list today might be finish my outline, or it might be find 3 inspirational pictures on Instagram that I want to use while I'm writing to keep my imagination going. And then the next action after that might be write 500 words on chapter 2. So having clear goals is very important. I think you need to visualize your goals. They need to be goals that get you excited, and you should never feel like your goal is too ridiculous. Have a big goal. Have an awesome, huge goal that gets you excited. Anything short of that's not going to work.
I think when you and you can nail it down, like for instance, my goals, short and long. My long-term goal is to eventually be a full-time writer. That's my long-term. That's my big overarching goal. That's where I'm aiming for. To get there, I have a short-term goal, which is to finish a novel and a collaboration project that I'm working on. And if you want to go even shorter than that, my daily goal, I want to write 1,000 to 1,500 words on that project. And I know those goals, and I know it going into the week and the days. These are the goals that I have, and these goals are manageable. The becoming a full-time writer is not manageable tomorrow, but I can manage 1,000 words. That's a little chunk of my goal. And knowing that's where I want to go helps me sit down in front of the computer every day and put those words on paper. And I think before I got into the indie writing, I dabbled in writing for years. I mean, since I've been 14, but I would sit down and write for a couple of days on a story that's like, oh, I really like that. And then a couple of days later, I would get distracted and I didn't have a goal. And so I wouldn't write for 2 months. And so I think having those goals in mind, it might not be being a full-time writer. It might just be publishing your first novel. But knowing that as a goal, I think will help a lot of writers.
Absolutely. I think that, it's the small victories that eventually win the war collectively. And it's the same thing here. You have your big goals of, say, becoming a full-time writer, but you have to do the little ones to get there. But I also think it's important to mention that you need to make sure your goals are things that you can directly affect. If you have a goal that is, I want to sell 45,000 copies of my first book, that's not really up to you. Getting a good book written, getting a good cover on it, and getting good product description attached to it and putting it in the right marketplaces, those are the things you can affect. But beyond that, at some point, you have to realize that sort of thing is up to the buying public. So set your goals, absolutely. Make them big goals, absolutely. But always be mindful of what it is you can directly affect and realize that at some point it's really out of your hands.
That's the best takeaway from this whole Keystroke Medium Minute is that you pick those goals like Chuck said, and you'll be a lot happier. Just trust me on that.
Yeah, it's like, I think it's important to focus on the work and not the results of the work, because sometimes the results aren't up to you.
Okay, well, this has been Josh for Chuck and Scott. Thanks for listening to this Keystroke Minute. You can find more of our show at keystrokemedium.com, where we have author interviews and craft discussion and a lot of shenanigans. Come out and hang out with us.
Shenanigans.
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Joe Abercrombie on the show with me today. You fantasy lovers are probably familiar with Joe through his First Law Trilogy and much more. I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
Yeah, it's a difficult one for me because it's a terrible memory of my childhood. It's just a bunch of vague, misty memories seen through a kind of veil of fog. So I don't remember any kind of individual moment. I was always a big fantasy reader. I was a huge lover of The Hobbit and of The Lord of the Rings growing up. And I think I was always fascinated by the maps you'd find in fantasy books. And I became a kind of keen role-playing gamer, Dungeons and Dragons and things of that kind. And so I was always fascinated by drawing my own maps and making my own worlds and, I guess, spinning tales within those worlds as well. Fantasy for me has always been a kind of a sandbox for making up your own stories, maybe more than any other genre. And so I've always thought myself as a bit of a storyteller, as a kind of, role-playing gamer, I suppose. But it wasn't until I got into my 20s, really, that I started to take seriously the idea of writing myself.
I think the love of fantasy is a common thread with a lot of writers, even writers that don't go on to write fantasy themselves. A lot of us, begin with Lewis and Tolkien and those stories. I wonder what it is about fantasy that really intrigues us, especially when we're of those young, impressionable ages.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I suppose the idea of somewhere totally other, something totally foreign, is an interesting one, and the idea of being able to make up your own world with your own rules always interested me. I think that kind of that big act of creation somehow. There's something fascinating about that. I read a lot of science fiction and all kinds of other things as well as a kid, but for me, somehow nothing ever really gripped me from a creative point of view. As a consumer, I was certainly into a whole spread of things, but whenever I thought about writing or creating something, it was always in a kind of fantasy setting. That was always what fascinated me, I think.
Right. As a youngster growing up in America, America's this odd place that really doesn't have a great sense of history. When we think of history, we're thinking 200 years ago. In England, where you grew up, when you think history, we're talking, 1,000 years. And I think for a lot of us, when we're reading fantasy or playing role-playing games, we kind of romanticize England and the UK as being this magical place with all of this history and things like that. But as a kid growing up there, do you have the same sense? Or is that just a thing that we Americans romanticize?
Yeah, so it's hard to know what the American experience of fantasy is. I mean, clearly there's a kind of a fascination in America with Britain and with Europe more generally, and with that kind of medieval era and anything that's sort of deeply historical. Perhaps growing up in Britain, you don't have quite the same sort of respect for history that you might have, because it's all around you to a greater degree. I grew up in the north of Britain near the Lake District, so there was a lot of very dramatic landscape around, and I think that was always a big influence on me. Yeah,
sure. At what point did you start tabletop gaming?
I guess maybe around 9 or 10. I think Traveller was the first thing I was exposed to, and then shortly after that, Dungeons and Dragons, and then a whole range of others: Warhammer, RuneQuest, Paranoia, Middle Earth, Roleplaying. There was a whole range of stuff. Pretty much anything that was around at the time, I was a huge enthusiast for it, and was always to be found with a pencil in my hand and some squared paper, sketching out, or a piece of land or a new world of some kind.
What was the big fascination with role-playing gaming for you? Was it that you could embody a character? Was it the cooperative storytelling? What was it that fascinated you?
It was a bit of everything. I think it was the kind of opportunity to be part of a group of friends and have an activity to do with them, an adventure or a character, a world. And it was, I think, a certain degree of the kind of nerdy obsessiveness about lists and numbers and dice, and there's definitely something that was very... Yeah, so there's a whole range of things that I found interesting about role-playing, I guess. And the kind of nerdy obsessiveness with lists and rule systems and numbers and levels and all those things, there was definitely an attraction to that as well. A whole range of stuff, I guess.
What did you see yourself doing when you got out of school, Joe? Did you have any sort of, guiding pursuit that, when I get out of school and I'm on my own, I'm going to go do this thing? Most people don't realize that they want to be writers until they've had a little experience. No. What was the thing that you wanted to do?
I really never had a plan at all. I assumed I'd probably go to university because most people in my family had done. But I had no grand scheme for a career at all. And I really just fell from one thing into another. I think in my last year of school, I went to visit a careers counsellor, and after a long consultation, he came back to me with insurance as my ideal job. But I went off to do psychology at university, and then really followed my nose from there. I left university newly qualified.
So I'd kind of I'd done 3 years of university rather aimlessly, without any particular plans for later, and because I didn't really want to continue with psychology as a career, it wasn't something that had particularly gripped me in that way. I kind of moved down to London with some friends, just in the hope that inspiration would strike, and ended up hanging around with the father of one of them, who was a news producer, and kind of carrying cameras and sort of generally hanging around, and eventually wangled my way into a job in a post-production company, TV editing, basically, making tea. And gradually from there became an assistant editor and eventually a freelance TV editor. And that was really what I did before becoming a writer. And I did that for about 10 years, mostly working on documentaries, a lot of weather-related documentaries, about tornadoes, the fastest winds on Earth, and that kind of stuff. And also a lot of live music. I did a lot of concerts and awards shows and things of that kind. I worked for Iron Maiden for a little while, and all sorts of bands. So it was an interesting time and quite an interesting job altogether.
Wow. Doing the TV editing and the putting together documentaries and things like that, I'm assuming that you begin to learn a lot about narrative structure in putting those things together, because documentaries are some of the most compelling TV usually, because there's a pretty strong narrative, and the documentary filmmaker is steering the viewer in a certain direction. Did you pick up things about storytelling from doing that sort of work?
Oh, I'm sure a huge amount. Yeah. I'd been a very keen reader before, so I'd kind of read a lot. I had no sort of formal writing training, if you like, but I'd read a lot, so I had some idea. But working on documentaries is a very different thing structurally, and it's very different from drama as well. With drama, you've got a script, for one thing, to begin with, and the script is what everything flows from. The script is what's shot. So as an editor, you can obviously move things around, you can change the point at which things happen. There are many important decisions to make, but it's very different to editing a documentary, where often there is no script until you get into the edit, and the whole thing is structured and created, at least partly in the edit. And so sitting with the director and having all these pieces you've then got to throw up in the air and kind of generate a story or a narrative thread out of is quite an interesting and involved process. And I had the opportunity to sit down with some really skilled script doctors and people who would chip away at a script and cut it down to its most elegant essence, if you like. And that was fascinating to see how a skilled person would work on it and reduce it all, let the pictures tell the story as much as possible. And you also, I think, get, hopefully as an editor, you develop a sense for timing, for what needs to be shown in a scene and what you can cut out, the key things that need to be said, the key things that need to be shown, how you leave a scene on a certain movement, on a certain sound, on the shutting of a door. You come in on the opening of a door. And I think those skills are obviously different when you're writing than they are when you're cutting something visual. But there is something universal there. So you certainly, I think, develop an understanding for how to come into a scene, how to leave, how to build up tension within a scene, how to pace things, and, most importantly of all, what you can cut out.
Right.
Because I think, it's about the notes you don't play, I think, is the Miles Davis quote, or perhaps a misquote. But this idea that what you cut out is more important than what you leave in often. And as a writer, I'm always trying to kind of cut everything away and reveal what's essential, if you like. So I think that was, working as an editor was very useful training for that.
And letting the reader get to be comfortable in the space between the notes there, and the things that you don't say that sometimes are more eerie or more impactful than the things you spell out for them.
Yeah, and I think, giving hints rather than giving it all away, these are all kind of things you learn as you go along. And yeah, I mean, the editing was certainly hugely important, although often it's subconscious, a lot of this as well, so you don't realise until much later what you've learned and what you've taken in and how you've applied it.
What did you work on for Iron Maiden?
I did some documentaries about their early years. So they did a kind of set of career retrospectives where they had, pretty much gathered all the footage there was of them together, and then kind of released them as a set of, this is 5 years of their career, here's another 3 years of their career. And I did the first 2 or 3 of those, so they each had some kind of documentary attached to them where it was sort of interviews with previous band members, and all the current band members discussing how the band came together. So it was a kind of 2.5 hour long big documentary in effect. And then I also did a couple of concerts for them. There was a big show at Donington they did that had sort of lain unedited for some time, and I edited that for them, and a few other bits and pieces. Nice.
So were those the early days documentaries they did?
Yeah, I think they probably were. Yeah.
Nice. How fun! As a kid that loved fantasy and role-playing games and all that, I bet working with Iron Maiden would have been just a kind of a geek fest.
Oh yeah, and I kind of worked on all sorts of different concerts and bands and things, and I think it's interesting. You have to find stuff to like, even in stuff you don't like necessarily, even in things that wouldn't be your taste. So you cut all kinds of different things, and you sort of seek out what is good in them, if you like, even when it's not your taste. So I think that's quite an important lesson to learn as well. That you are looking for the good stuff.
Right. Exactly. So at what point, Joe, did
editor was very useful training.
Sure. At what point, Joe, did the writing bug bite? So you've been editing. What was that first story idea that kind of grabbed a hold of you and you had to start writing it?
Well, I've had this idea for a fantasy world, I guess you'd say, for years, or a collection of different ideas, or perhaps a collection of different things stolen from other writers and writers of supplements and role-playing games and things. I've sort of incorporated all sorts of different ideas that I liked into a world that's been at the back of my mind for a long time, and there were characters within it who had developed. And I'd started to have some ideas about what I would do if I wrote a big epic fantasy. And I guess I'd been editing for 7 or 8 years. I was working as a freelancer. I was getting paid pretty well for the time, but there's not much of a career path to that job. Once you've reached the point of being a freelance editor, it's quite hard to move on to something else. And I kind of felt the need to have some other string to my bow, if you like, something I could do in the time off between jobs, and also something that I would completely own myself, because as an editor, you're an important part of the team, but it's never your baby, really. You're brought in to do your part of the work, and then you move on, So I wanted something that I had control over, and obviously, writing is something you can do with relatively little investment of money. You can sit down with a piece of paper and start to do it. And it was something I'd often thought about, so I thought I'd give it a go, and see what would happen. I had tried to write something a little while before, when I was aged about 20, really as a touch typing exercise. I taught myself touch typing, and once I'd worked out where the keys were, I needed something I could just type to practice the skill. And so I thought I'd start writing this epic fantasy I'd occasionally thought of. That turned out pretty badly, if I'm honest. Pretty pompous, pretty derivative. When I tried again to write more or less the same thing, this time in my late 20s, having spent a few years in the workplace, taking myself and fantasy generally, I think, a bit less seriously, maybe, it straight away had, a voice to it and a certain tone to it that I found interesting myself, at least, and really made me feel, there's something interesting. I want to explore this and find out what's there. It felt like it had a voice that came from, that wasn't just my voice. It seemed to come from somewhere else almost. I found it straight away quite compelling, the act of writing.
You said that you started taking yourself and fantasy a little less serious. What do you mean by that? Was it just like holding fantasy as this precious thing, and it's it's always white and good and evil, white and black? Do you mean it like that, or what do you mean?
Well, I certainly, I'd read a lot of fantasy from the age of sort of, I suppose, 8 or 9 through till 15 or 16. That was really the main thing I was reading, although I read all kinds of other things. And I read an awful lot of the sort of commercial fantasy of the 80s and 90s, David Eddings and Dragonlance, things of that kind, and loved all that stuff. But I think I started to feel, as I got a little bit older, that it was slightly predictable, and I was reading the same kinds of things again and again. They were quite morally pull. They were quite focused on setting. There was maybe an effort to kind of out-Tolkien, if you like, with the scale and the grandeur. And there wasn't really a feel of being in the heads of the characters, that I got from some of the other fiction I was reading, some of the kind of literary fiction and the classics I was reading. And there wasn't a kind of sense of danger about it and a sense of edge and unpredictability that I would get from, noir fiction or from westerns or that kind of thing. And so I started to get a bit frustrated with fantasy and just gradually read less until I wasn't really reading it in my 20s. And so I suppose, I just started to get a little frustrated and feel like there was a need for something, a new, a slightly different approach. And then in the mid-90s or the early 90s, I was given Game of Thrones by a friend. Game of Thrones, I should say. And I saw expressed in that book, obviously, quite a lot of that kind of grit and that focus on characters and that shock value, if you like, that I really felt had been missing. And it sort of demonstrated to me that you could write something with the virtues of epic fantasy, but that was also shocking and a bit dark and character-focused and sort of gritty. And it made me feel like I wanted to try something of that kind myself, I guess.
After reading a Game of Thrones and having that experience, what came to you first? Was it the character? What was it? Logen Ninefingers? Was it the setting? Kind of how did you immerse yourself in this new world that you were creating and eventually came up with the Blade itself?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of the characters went back way before that. So, Logen Ninefingers was a character who'd been in my mind for many years, from the age of maybe 11 or 12 even. But he was a very simple, straightforward character then. And as I got older, he kind of got a bit more complicated. And so many of the scenes I wrote kind of age 20 for the start of this book were pretty much the same scenes I wrote age 28, 29, after reading Game of Thrones and having some life experience. But the tone of voice was totally different. So, whereas before, for example, Logen would stand majestically upon the icy peaks and gaze down upon the valley beneath. Afterwards, he would sort of stumble along, fall over, hurt himself, think about how much he needed to go to the toilet, that kind of thing. There was a very different feel to the way that I did it. So many of the characters were very old and well established for me, but the tone of voice definitely changed and developed and became much more wry and sidelong, and I think honest, really. And that was probably the one thing that really excited me about it, was that it felt like something kind of honest and truthful, and that was what I wanted to explore.
Joe, your writing has a very visceral sort of feel to it. When you open up the first few pages of one of your books, you are immediately transferred to this world and into these characters' heads. I read a lot of fantasy and I read a lot of different stuff for doing this podcast and just for enjoyment. And sometimes I'll go back and I'll read some older fantasy, and I'm a huge fan of Terry Brooks and all that he's done. But you go back and you read some of those early Shannara books, the first trilogy, and you're 50 pages in before anything really happens, and there's a lot of there's a lot of flowery language, and a lot of world building is going on, and that stuff is important to that story and becomes needful, but your stories drop you right in. Is that a conscious thing, or is that just you talking like you were just saying about kind of being true to that character and really getting in to what that character's thinking and feeling, and is that the important thing to drop the reader in on?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it certainly is. Whether that was explicitly on my mind when I first sat down and started writing, I'm not sure. Or whether it was just the way that it naturally felt the right way to tell the story. But I think certainly I wanted, sometimes with fantasy, it's the setting that is the thing that defines it in a way. It's another world with other rules and a different map. And so I think people have tended often to focus a bit on the setting at the cost of the characters, You often get these vast, beautiful, detailed landscapes with perhaps these little, slightly indistinct and unremarkable figures lost in the midst. And I really wanted to have the reader pushed up close to the people, The Western and a John Ford Western, if you like. I wanted the sweaty close-up. I wanted it to feel like you were really pressed up with these people, like you were in their heads, you could understand what drove them. I think as well, it was maybe partly born out of a frustration with the villains in fantasy, where they're a little bit hard to understand. They're evil for the sake of it. When you really think about it, is what they're doing make any real sense, Or without understanding what happens in their mind, it's hard to understand why they really behave that way. They behave that way because you need a villain, not because it makes internal sense. And so I was kind of interested in looking at some villainous types of character perhaps and getting in their heads and seeing what made them tick and how they might rationalize their behavior and how they might, see themselves as the good guys in the story, because everyone in reality does, in the end, see themselves as being in the right generally. So yeah, I definitely wanted to drop people into the heads of the characters, and also I didn't want that slightly formulaic feel you sometimes get with fantasy stories, where you begin on the farm with the untried characters, the unformed farm boy. It's really, there's nothing before the start. There's no history to the people, if you like. There's history to the world, but the people are these maybe unformed characters who then learn and grow during the course of the story. And I wanted people who were full of backstory, and we find them in the midst of their lives, with all kinds of mess and difficulty behind them and lots of mess and difficulty to come. I wanted ragged starts and I wanted ragged ends, and I wanted really to drop the reader in and feel they were immersed right from the start in the experience of the people, not too much time spent setting the table. And I think with The Blade itself, in my first book, I hadn't, I was experimenting for the first time with writing, and so I wasn't totally as effective at doing that as I have perhaps later become. So I think there's more setting at the table in that book than I would do now. I'd be more confident in really just dropping people straight into the heads of the characters and letting them sink or swim, if you like.
What you said about villains, I completely agree with that. Some of the most compelling villains are the ones that really believe they are the hero of the story, and they're misguided, or to have, their motives, at least to them, are pure, and they're trying to save their people, their race, or whatever, and and those become really compelling stories. But in fantasy, is there a place where evil is just evil?
Well, I think that there certainly can be, and when I talk about the way I've chosen to do things, I suppose I never would make that a manifesto, if you want, for how things should be. I love Tolkien. I think it's fantastic. I still love it as much as ever, in a way, Lord of the Rings. But I think it became so dominant as the kind of form that it became a bit repetitive, what flowed from Tolkien, if you like.
Right.
And so there was fallow ground to do the opposite or to do something different. But I think, stories where there's a very clean and clear good and evil, as there is in Lord of the Rings, there's definitely a place for that. And in a way, it's those stories that make the opposite, stories where things are very grey and muddy and hard to know what good or evil is, that make those interesting. Spaghetti westerns are fascinating by contrast with classic westerns. Without classic westerns, they almost don't make any sense. So you've got to refer to something. When you tackle a genre, the interesting thing is the expectations readers have that you can play with, and you wouldn't have those without what's gone before. So very clear good and evil morality is very interesting and has lots of things to say. But the nice thing about it is you can then have very dirty grey morality to stand up against it, and that allows you to ask some questions of the reader.
Sure. Joe, when you first started writing that first novel, what surprised you the most in the writing of it, and maybe about your skill as a storyteller? Did you find that you just kind of fell into it, and once you had kind of unlocked what it was that you felt was the missing key to writing fantasy?
Well, certainly everything that I did, I fell into. No doubt of that. There was no grand plan for it, and I had no real... I talk about things looking back as though there was a plan and a certain thing that I was, consciously reacting to and wanted to do differently. But a lot of it was just what happened when I sat down and started writing the scenes. And I think the thing that surprised me right from the start, at least this second time that I started trying to write as an adult, was the kind of voices the characters had and how defined those felt, really from very early on. And I was just fascinated by that, and I became really interested in how you develop a voice for a character. And in a sense, I think a lot of what I've done since I wrote the First Law, since I wrote that book, has been trying to recreate in laboratory settings, if you will, the happy accident that happened with the characters in that first book. Because I think in that first book I had 20 years of development and thought and ideas that went into the kind of the voices and the personalities of those characters. And then creating characters much more quickly for later books is a very different thing. So I thought these characters were just spilling out very naturally. It wasn't until I started to write new characters for my fourth book, as it was, that I realized, the characters in that trilogy had been with me for a long time, and their voices had been kind of developing for a long time and were ready to drop out to a degree.
Yeah. How long did it take you to write that first book?
I think maybe about 3 years, but I got a lot faster. So I might have spent a year writing the first, 10 or 15 chapters, because I went over and over and over things at that point. I'd write a paragraph, and then I'd sit and congratulate myself on how clever I was, which I love to do, of course. And then I would cut it down a bit, rethink it, look at what worked, what didn't. Then I'd write another paragraph, congratulate myself on my cleverness, cut that one down, and then I'd read them together, and then I'd add another. And every time I sat down, I'd read what I'd written the night before and edit it. And that process of kind of going over and over, editing, seeing what worked, experimenting with, where to use dialogue, where to use internal thought, where to describe and where not to describe, all those kind of things. Experimenting with the pacing and the rhythm of the writing and how to get a kind of distinctive voice for each character into the chapters of that character. I spent a lot of time just sitting there working on that and thinking about that and playing with it, really, I guess. And once I'd started to become more confident and quicker, that was when I really sat down to plan a bit more carefully, because those first few chapters I kind of wrote without any great overarching plan, certainly not specific plans for each chapter. I just followed my nose, really. And then I thought, okay, if I'm taking this seriously, I've got to have a plan and an idea, and where am I going with this? And then I started to sit down and plan, and to execute the plan a bit more, with a bit more technicality, I suppose, a bit more workmanlike way. And I got a lot faster. So it took about 3 years overall, but certainly, the second half maybe only took about 10 months to a year, because I was taking it pretty seriously by that point.
Did when you sat down, when you started kind of realizing the tedium of what you were doing and knowing that you needed a plan, did you conceptualize the story out from there? When you started writing, did you know the ending of the book, or did you just kind of give yourself some firmer rules to work within?
It's actually it's a bit hard to say. I wish I knew, because it's hard to cast my mind back, and it's very easy over time to kind of imagine you did something you didn't, if you like, or imagine there was more of a guiding plan. I seem to remember I wrote the first 7 or 8 chapters, and I suppose I always had a rough idea of where I was aiming to take the story, of who the central cast were going to be, and roughly where I wanted to end up, partly because the First Law very consciously follows a lot of the tropes and the paths of a classic epic fantasy, and that was always, very much the idea. In the same way that I guess, something like Unforgiven is a very, very classic Western in many ways. It's a story you've heard 1,000 times before. It's a used-up man of violence drawn back for one last job and encountering a tough sheriff on a frontier town. I mean, that could be 100 films, but it's the way it's told that makes it unique and a kind of new take on the material, if you like. So I wanted to do my take on a classic fantasy. So in that sense, there needed to be a quest, there needed to be a big battle at the end, there needed to at least appear to be a battle between good and evil that I then wanted to investigate a bit more carefully towards the end. And, in terms of the characters, I wanted a boy with a special destiny, and a used-up man of violence, and a wizard with mysterious motives. And many of those things are really classic in fantasy, but I was going to try, I guess, to do something different in the way that I told the story. So in terms of planning, it was really about sitting down and thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to chop this book up chop this trilogy up, this story into 6 parts, and what will be the focus of each part. And then I just started breaking it down into chapters and thinking what point of view each chapter would be from, and getting a bit more explicit about exactly the ground that I needed to cover and how I was going to do it.
If you would have only had the forethought to know how many people this trilogy would have affected, and how deeply people would have cared about these characters, it would have been nice to have kind of documented that along the way, but it probably would have been crippling also at the time. When you've never written anything, and then you start thinking about the potential audience and all of the people that are going to be rabid about these characters. Sometimes it's good that we don't know.
Oh, I think definitely it was good that I didn't know. And, you both have this weird split personality, or at least I did, because, on the one hand, I was kind of very excited by what was coming out, and I kind of loved reading it in a weird way and finding out what was going to happen next. And so I had huge hopes of massive success and dreams of, literary parties and all that stuff. But at the same time, I also thought no one would ever read it, and I was purely doing it for my own amusement. So those two are always slightly fighting inside your head. I mean, if I thought it was actually going to be published at all, which, I didn't necessarily, I would probably have done things differently to some degree. But But as you say, it worked out well, so it's probably just as well that I didn't. And I think there is a kind of a freedom in an author's first book often. I sometimes think that inspiration, drops during a career often, and the craft sort of increases to compensate a little bit, if you like. You do use up ideas, and you use up the things that are close to you and that come to you automatically, and have to reach a little further for things. And the first book often has a sort of a raw quality of that new voice that as a reader you haven't experienced before, that is very hard to replicate with later books. There's a diminishing return often as you get through an author's work. And so, you need that period of kind of abandonment where you're not thinking about the rules, you're not thinking about the audience, you're not thinking about the commercial aspects and that you've got to pay your mortgage. You're just doing it for the love of it. And that's hard to recapture. In a way, I think you spend a lot of your professional career trying to recapture the joy of being an amateur, if you like.
You went on after that first trilogy. You wrote some standalone books that are in the world of the First Law, or sort of standalone. And one of my favorite books that you've written is Red Country. And I've heard you reference westerns a couple of times that we've been talking here. What is your fascination with westerns, and how did you go about creating a fantasy book with a that's basically a western and has that whole feel, and it reads like Unforgiven?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it's nice you like that book. I mean, I think one thing that I'm quite pleased with is that if you ask people what my best book is, you'll get a lot of different answers. There's not one that people say, yeah, you really nailed it with that one, but the other stuff, the different books appeal to different people, and I kind of feel that is a vindication of having tried to do some slightly different things with each one. With the standalones, I think it goes back to finishing my trilogy, really, and when you set out to write something so ludicrously ambitious as your first project, you never really think, what am I going to do when this is finished? The idea of finishing it seems so remote and impossible. But I was writing the third book and had a deal, and the first book was out. And my editor said to me, what are you going to do when this is over? And I had this hideous epiphany that I might have to write, 30 more books, 50 more books in a career. And I needed to pitch some ideas to the publisher, basically. And so I started thinking about what I wanted to do. And I'm not necessarily a world guy, if you like. I don't do really extravagant and strange worlds that have a particular point to make. There didn't seem any purpose in moving to a new world just for the sake of it. So I thought, I'll work within the world I've got, use some of the characters I've got, but maybe tell a more standalone, concentrated style of story in the same world. And so I kind of naturally went to films, because I've always been, very, as much influenced by films and by TV, I think, as I am by books in a way. And I thought I've got to write 3 books, really. So I'll think of 3 films that I love and try and sort of distill them down to their essence and apply it to this fantasy world and see what I end up with. And the 3 films were Point Blank, the Lee Marvin gangster revenge story, Bridge Too Far, the big war film, and Unforgiven, or possibly The Outlaw Josie Wales, both those 2 westerns. And the Lee Marvin story became Best Served Cold, when Lee Marvin turned into a woman, obviously, because that's always been a dream. And the war story became The Heroes. And so the western became Red Country. And I guess the idea was to kind of take, all sorts of western notions and then play them out in this fantasy setting. Because although, we clearly think of 6-shooters and chaps and Stetsons and, the coming of the steam train and things as the Western is very classically America of that period, the fundamentals of the Western are really, I think, the way in which civilization collides with the kind of uncivilized frontier, if you like, and the pioneer spirit of settlers kind of moving out to claim this unclaimable wasteland. So there's no reason you can't do that within a fantasy setting. So I kind of just threw the kitchen sink of Western stuff at a fantasy world, and tried to work in all the Western standards that I really loved. Why it is I have a thing for Westerns? It's funny, you were talking earlier about the American fascination with Britain, but I think there's an equally powerful British fascination with America of a different kind. The American myth of the West, that's very compelling, I think, to British people who feel like the world is small and known and explored. That idea of the kind of untamed frontier is very powerful, and very strange in a sense to the European way of thinking.
I just thought about that. Yeah, I just thought about that as you were talking, that we don't know what it's like to have that deep history that you have, and it's difficult for you guys to imagine a place that hasn't been trodden on forever.
Yeah, and I was slightly worried when writing something Westerny that obviously I'm not American, and so in a way you're appropriating someone else's stuff, and can you do it well, or will you make a mess of it? I suppose that all depends on the reader up to a point. But Western films are a big part of my childhood, because when I was growing up there were always Westerns on TV. It was the kind of dominant form of cinema for a long time, and so watching old Westerns was a big thing for me, and then I became fascinated by the way that spaghetti Westerns messed with the form and introduced a new approach, and then those late Clint Eastwood Westerns, Unforgiven, Outlaw Josey Wales and others, again did something new again. And I wanted to try and do that kind of thing with a fantasy story. So yeah, trying a Western just seemed like a no-brainer to me. It was something I'd always wanted to do. And I think it seemed like something, it's certainly not the only thing that's ever tried to, fuse Western and fantasy, but it's not common. It felt like an original enough idea that it was something that was well worth trying.
And it's beautifully done. I love it. When I say that's one of my favorite things you've done, I really mean that. That book really stood out to me. So kudos on that.
Thank you.
You were talking about movies a minute ago, and one piece of advice that everybody gives to new writers is, if you want to be a writer, you need to read a lot and you need to write a lot, and no one argues with that. Those things are essential. They're cornerstones. Absolutely, you have to be an avid reader if you want to be a writer. But I think movies and episodic television can play a huge part in the creative process these days, especially stuff that's done well. That's a creative outlet that I don't think gets enough attention. I think people just immediately turn their nose up to that. But storytelling, when done right, is storytelling, and I think we can learn a lot from every medium.
Absolutely, and I mean, as you say, there's some wonderful, wonderful writing on television these days. Television has transformed in since the millennium, I guess, and before, but certainly the last 10, 20 years are a real golden age of TV, where it feels as though, the really powerful artistic statements are happening on the small screen rather than the big often these days. And as a medium for that kind of long-form narrative, things like Netflix, things like Amazon Prime, they've really changed the way in which TV is watched and consumed and the way in which it's made. And they've allowed for these much more in-depth, much more long-form, much more kind of comfortable in their own skin styles of storytelling. You don't have to hit ad breaks every time. You don't have to hit certain beats for the TV audience, very different to the TV that I grew up with. And there's some amazing, brilliant writing there. These days, I'm ashamed to say I do read quite a lot of non-fiction, but I don't read much fiction now. I find it a bit of a busman's holiday, if you like. It feels too much like work, and feels I can often be slightly polluted by what I'm reading. If I read something with a very strong style, I find that I'm writing like a bad Cormac McCarthy, for instance, was one thing that happened while I was writing Red Country, actually. I read Blood Meridian and I thought, wow, this is really good. And then I looked back at the chapters I'd written while I was reading it, and they were kind of written in this rather bad Baroque sub-Cormac McCarthy style. So you've got to be careful of that a little bit. So most of my, leisure time, I spend watching television much more than I spend reading now. But I think there's just as many lessons to be learned there about good writing and good storytelling, and the range and the types of character we see on shows of that kind now. It's just so broad, and some really fascinating dramatic choices being made.
Right. Joe, you went on to write another series, The Shattered Sea, and this is a new world and a different audience. Tell us a little bit about the motivation for this series, and how was the creative process different for you?
Yeah, it grew out of a whole range of different things, as things tend to for me. First of all, I was approached by a guy called Nick Lake, who's a young adult editor, who liked my adult books, and he thought I could do a good young adult book. He was interested in commissioning basically a young adult book from me, and he said, "Have you ever considered it? Is there anything you'd like to do?" And so it didn't. I was writing Heroes at the time, I think, and I had a lot else on my plate. But the idea sort of stewed at the back of my mind, and I had a few young adultish notions, but it felt like the right time to do something different after Red Country, when I'd written, the trilogy and the 3 standalones. I felt, I'd spent a lot of time in the same world. I'd written 6 books, and though they each had their own, different approach, I guess, they were in the same world. They had many characters in common. They were all kind of gritty adult books with a certain tone and approach. And I kind of felt the need to try something different. I was interested as well in writing much shorter books if I could. I guess when I was a kid, Lord of the Rings was the huge book. There was nothing bigger. If you could tackle Lord of the Rings, that was the biggest of the big. These days, Lord of the Rings is barely one volume in a multi-volume series. The first Lord's longer than Lord of the Rings, which is hard to believe. And when you look at the kind of, like Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, 14 big books, and the kind of the length of the books in George R.R. Martin's series, they're enormous, 400,000 word books, massive. And there's definitely a value to that. People can get lost in this incredible kind of detail and richness and an all-encompassing world. But I guess I get a bit worried by the idea that you have to be massive, that quality is weighed out in weight of paper. And I was kind of fascinated by the idea, or I wanted to see if I could, write something that had the scale and the scope and the adventure, if you like, but in a much tighter, shorter form, like, I don't know, Wizard of Earthsea, say, Ursula Le Guin's Wizard of Earthsea, which I absolutely love and thought, as a kid was a big influence. And there's a writer called Rosemary Sutcliffe, a British writer of historical fiction, whose stuff I loved growing up, who writes kind of Viking fiction about Roman Britain and things like that, and writes these very tight, very spare, very compelling books. So I wanted to write shorter, and I guess the opportunity was there to write for a younger audience, and so it felt like a good opportunity to write something more contained, in a slightly different style and for a different audience, and to try a different tone, I guess. I was thinking in the end about a Viking influenced world so much earlier, historically, I suppose, than the First Law world, which is kind of on the cusp of the Renaissance moving towards the modern age. And that allowed for a slightly more saga-like tone, so just something slightly different to approach, and I could be a bit more into the details of the language with a much shorter book. So it was kind of a whole range of different ideas that came together for that one.
Was the writing different in considering that the audience was going to be young adult as opposed to just kind of unfettered writing, if you will, in your adult books?
I mean, I don't feel like it was massively different. I certainly wanted to write something that still worked for the adult readers that I had. I suppose, in writing young adult, I tried not to make it an exercise in hitting certain expected marks for that genre, if you like, and I think that may have made it actually in the end a little bit difficult to market. and to pigeonhole, and perhaps difficult to sell as a young adult often as well. Because I wanted to write something that still had the kind of shocks in it and still had some of the grit. I wanted it to feel like a tough, dangerous world still. And so it wasn't necessarily a case of kind of, I wrote it full of blood and guts and swearing and then cut those things out. It was more that, the whole tone I was going for was a slightly different one. Yeah. And, I always try and write differently from different characters' points of view anyway, so writing from younger characters' points of view just naturally made for a different style of story and a kind of different way of thinking. And also this, slightly Viking style of world lent itself to a bit of a more, saga is the best way I can put it, a different tone, a kind of different rhythm to the language, if you like. Yeah.
In the First Law books, we talked about this earlier, having characters that had a backstory, and you drop into the character's life, but all through the book you can tease out this backstory, and you can determine why this character is who he or she is, and what their motivations are, and things like that. When writing younger characters, do you begin with characters that are less broken? For lack of a better term, to begin with, and does that affect the tone of the story because you don't have all of the backstory to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good way of putting it. Certainly, I had worked with a lot of, protagonists in their 30s, in their 40s, older people who had a lot of water under the bridge, were carrying a lot of weight of the past. So it was interesting to work with teenage characters, adolescent characters, coming of age type stories. They almost inevitably become, in a way, when you're dealing with characters that age. And they were much blanker pages, and they were people who developed a lot during the course of those stories. And I suppose, one way of looking at it is they were, it was the opportunity to see how characters developed into the sort of characters you saw in my adult work, in a way. And, I did think of these as a gateway drug, if you like, that would lead people naturally on to my adult stuff. So I wanted them to have a lot of the same tone and the same concerns. And, I was saying earlier that I want things to feel kind of honest and truthful. It was advice my mother gave me very early on in my writing. Always be truthful, my son, she said. And so, I wanted it not to feel like it was some kind of sanitized version of my usual stuff. I wanted it to feel like it was, honest and truthful and would give people the thing that they, hopefully expect from my adult stuff.
Sure. Your latest book that's published is called Sharp Ends. It's a collection of shorter fiction. Yeah. Were these stories that you had written throughout the writing of the other books, pieces to connect the other pieces, or was this new stories? Where did this collection come from?
Yeah, it was kind of all of the above to a degree. So it's 13 stories, and they came from all sorts of different places and at different times. I guess I was approached, the first time I was approached about a short story was probably around when I was writing Best Served Cold, or just after. And my American editor, funnily enough, was putting together a collection called Swords and Dark Magic. This was Lou Anders, who was at Pyre then. And he was putting together a sword and sorcery anthology. And it was the first time I was invited to kind of contribute a story to an anthology, so I was very pleased to do that. And then over the years I've been asked to contribute to a few others. I've done 4 or 5 stories that have gone into anthologies with other writers, which is always nice because you kind of get to be exposed to maybe readers who wouldn't normally read your stuff, and perhaps some of them then seek out your full-length work, so it's always good to do that kind of thing. So there are a few stories I've done for that purpose over the years, and I often use those as a kind of way to experiment with characters I was thinking of using in a new book, so there's a set of characters in the heroes, and I wrote a short story about them some years before the heroes happens as a kind of way of testing out the voices of those characters and the dynamic of that group, really. And I did the same thing with Red Country. I wrote a story for Dangerous Women that was about the central character in Red Country who is a dangerous woman, and so it was appropriate to kind of have a go with that character and see how that felt, you know, a little episode from her past. So there were a few of those, and then there were a few stories that had kind of been explicitly written to go alongside a book. So sometimes there's a kind of demand from a bookseller to have some extra material in with a special edition of a book that they can then push a bit harder. And so I'd written a short story to go with the heroes, and another one to go with Red Country, and another one with Best Served Cold, I think, that hadn't really seen a broad release. They'd just been in a kind of very limited edition before. So those were kind of there as well. And there'd been a sort of undertaking sometime before. My editor had said, look, you know, if you've ever got enough short stories to make a collection, we'll publish. So, you know, I'd reached a point where I had 8 or 9 stories, and it felt then that I needed to add some more to give the collection some kind of backbone. So it didn't just feel like it was a bunch of disconnected vignettes that were scattered from all over the place. So I'd come up with this pairing of Java and Chevalier, who are this. It's really my take on Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, you know, the Fritz Lieber's classic sword and sorcery double act, which I love, and you know is obviously a really seminal fantasy staple, really. But I'd always written a lot of male characters. You know, my work's quite male heavy, especially with the First Law. I've got better at this over time, but a lot of men in the First Law, and so I thought it'd be interesting to do a female take on Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. So it's a female barbarian and a female thief who kind of have a long career of misadventures together in this kind of love-hate partnership. And so they naturally are just, you know, they don't necessarily appear in my other books, but they're a good pair of characters to produce short stories where they can kind of intersect with other people that we know from the books and run into different characters at different times in their careers. So scattering a few stories of them through the collection, I think, gave it a bit of a theme and a sense of direction to some degree.
Joe, what are you working on these days?
I am writing another trilogy, yeah. In the First Law world again. So adult stuff again. And it's interesting because the First Law was written, as we were saying earlier, under very different circumstances. You know, before I was, let alone a full-time writer, before I had any deal with the publisher, there was a long time for those characters and that story to kind of incubate without any pressure. And that's one big story in 3 parts. It's not really 3 individual books. The Shattered Sea is 3 books, but they're much shorter books, and also they're kind of 3 discrete stories in a way. There's not the same overarching narrative to take care of. So when I kind of started to think about writing another big trilogy that would be one big story, I felt like I couldn't really do it in 3 installments. You know, I couldn't publish a book and then write the second, publish that, and then write the third, because I'd get to the end and think, right, now I need to rewrite the front to make it fit. I felt like to really get something as unified and cohesive as I possibly could, I needed to write all 3 together, draft all 3 together, before releasing the first one. So that's what I've been doing, probably quite foolishly. There's always a pressure to get another book out there, you know. Your publisher always wants the next book. There's usually dates written into your contract that, you know, you can miss, but there's always a downside to that. So the industry is very much set up to get the next book out of your next book. And that, I think, can be sometimes a little bit destructive, and certainly destructive to a sort of big, long-form project like this. And so I kind of worked out a deal with my publisher whereby I'd get time to draft 3 books and then get the first ready. The upside being, you know, you hope once you've got those 3 drafters, you can prepare them one by one pretty quickly, and there shouldn't be, you know, any of the long waits that sometimes get fans a bit upset. And they might have a wait for the first book, but then there'll be, you know, the 3 will be coming pretty regularly one after the other. And it gives a publisher a chance to, you know, do it in the time that they want, at the time of year that they want, to kind of get all the planning in place, to make an event out of it, so that booksellers can really, get behind it and know when it's going to come. So it seemed like a sensible thing to do. Of course, the downside is you then stay out of the public domain for a while you try and get this monster there, and you sit on your own for quite a long time, and you maybe lack some of the sort of excitement and the contact with the outside world that keeps an author needs somewhat. But I've written 2 basically, drafted 2, and I'm just tightening up the first one, and then I'll probably get started on the third. So hopefully, 2019, the first will appear, beautifully whittled down, polished, sanded off, and ready for consumption, baked to a turn. That is the hope. But I'm all the way through this one. I've kind of said it'll come when it comes, because I'm sort of determined. It's good to have a sense of pressure, because otherwise you'd never get there. You do need some sort of spur to keep you going every day, but you also don't want to feel like you're rushed into doing things. And a couple of times I've agreed to a date because that's the date they wanted, and then, you get there and it's clear you're not going to make the date, and then it slips a couple of months, and that's just, it's not ideal. So I want to make sure it's all there, every I dotted and T crossed, and ready to go. And then hopefully, as I say, the 3 will spill forth in relatively rapid succession.
Well, and in today's market where there are so many fans that are upset with authors that we love because they've been promised a book for years and years and years, and it just doesn't come. That's a whole different kind of pressure on the author. And if we could leave the author alone, let them get the story the way it needs to be, and then deliver it in quick succession, I think that's a win for everybody.
I hope that it is, but at the same time, I kind of don't take any of that too seriously, because I feel like if you have lots of people enraged by your failure to deliver, that's really the biggest backhanded compliment an author can have, isn't it? Because,
yes.
If they didn't love the books and if they didn't desperately want the books, then they wouldn't be posting the angry comments in the end. And, the people who say, I will never read George R. R. Martin's book again, they'll be in a tent next to the bookshop.
Of course they will.
On the night of the night of release. So, I think people like a big, to get carried away and have a big controversy, don't they?
Yeah,
but
they like to make a lot of noise.
They take as long as they take, and
right.
Maybe it's not, the ideal thing for a career to have long gaps. But then again, for the right author and the right book, people are prepared to wait, and they'll still flock to the bookshop when the time comes.
Well, and that's why we have, podcasts like this, so that we can keep in touch with our favorite authors while they're working on those things, and to just check up on them and make sure they're still alive and, writing on those books that we love.
Make sure the keyboard is still working, still connected.
That's right. Yeah. And if you burn up the keyboard, we'll happily send you one.
Oh, that's
just
nice.
Let
that's
us
nice.
know. Yeah, just let us know. We're happy to contribute. Yeah. Joe, thank you so much for taking time to join me on this Halloween night to record. Where can people find you if they want to follow along with progress, and maybe they want to dig into your back catalog if they're not all that familiar with you? Where can they find you?
Well, I warmly recommend digging into the back catalog. Marvellous books to be found there. Marvellous.
That's what I've heard.
Yeah. I'm at www.joeabercrombie.com. The website is not updated as often as it once was, I will confess. A little bit cobwebby, but I try to do a bi-monthly progress update anyway, so there's usually a bit of information there. But I'm much more regularly on Twitter. At Lord Grimdark is my Twitter handle, and I'm kind of, I'm on there pretty routinely, so I tweet most days, if I'm honest. It's become such a kind of easy and straightforward way to communicate with people, Twitter, that I find it much easier. Blog posts, you've got to think about it, you've got to plan it. It takes some time out of your writing day, whereas, tweeting is something you can do without even thinking about it. Perhaps I should think about it more, in fact.
Joe, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. We really appreciate it.
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
His body broke free of its paralysis and he stumbled forward, losing his balance. He fell down the slope towards the spot where they had been. His hand shot out unthinkingly and he grabbed the corner of the black stone bridge. Hoofbeats. Pounding hoofbeats. Coming closer. Coming up the road. Someone or something galloped towards him. The head of an emaciated horse burst from the gloom of the road. The rider was fumbling, out of control, without saddle or bridle, clutching at the white mane, kicking the beast across the hindquarters with his thin legs, his face a frozen mask of terror. He whipped around to look back over his shoulder. Something chased him. Something terrible. Jason spun away as the horse ran over him, spearing him through the chest with its iron-shod hooves. He was unhurt. The horse galloped upward and across the bridge, across strong timbers, rough-hewn and knot-holed. The rider wheeled the horse about, looking back from the far shore. He was wheezing. A sloppy white ruffle bobbed under his chin. His face was hopeful now. A familiar face, much like the one Jason saw every morning in the mirror. Something thundered up behind Jason, not with a clatter of hoofbeats, but with the teeth-rattling thunder of stone on stone. Ichabod, yes, of course, the man was Ichabod, wailed, and the sound of his terror echoed across the valley. The hot breath of a horse burned the back of Jason's neck. He stood frozen, unable to turn his head to see the thing behind him. He didn't want to. This was no ordinary vision. He felt with certainty that the rider behind him, no, the horseman behind him, knew he was there. Ichabod kicked his horse. It reared, brayed, and would have thrown him but for the fistfuls of its mane he clutched. Horse and rider spun in place on the far side of the bridge, disoriented. The horseman behind Jason laughed. A terrible, deep, cracking sound from all directions, like 1,000 axes chopping down the woods. Jason felt searing heat as a ball of flame whipped over his shoulder. A burning jack-o'-lantern arced across the bridge. Its maniacal face spun end over end. It grinned back at Jason for an instant, spun around and crashed into Ichabod's temple, knocking him from his horse and into the dust. The pumpkin careened upwards, exploding against the trees, shooting tendrils of flame up their trunks, igniting branches and showering the world with sparks and flaming leaves. Jason recoiled, fell to his knees, and threw his arms over his face. His lungs and heart pumped wildly. They slowed. He brought his arms down. The bridge was broken again. It was over.